And we're very fortunate to have another speaker from the University of Maryland. Every speaker we have from the University of Maryland seems to do extremely well. And I'm convinced that Katerina Kane will follow in the proud Maryland tradition. She's a lecturer in the history department at the University of Pennsylvania, but she's also a local person because she's from suburban Philly and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and so close that actually her mother is here tonight. So we're very pleased to her to be here as well. Now, as far as Dr. Kean is concerned, that she has written on Southern women and their contributions to the modern feminist movement of the 60s and 70s, a topic I don't think that many people are familiar with, the role of Southern women in the feminist movement. Now, Dr. Kean is also the executive director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland. And of course, migration, very much a topic of our time. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Katerina Kane to Camden County College.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Valerie. I don't know if she's here. She coordinated my trip, and Joe up in the booth who made this possible. And everyone, all of you for showing up on a Wednesday night. I appreciate that. I know there's a baseball game tonight, so I appreciate this. And that you just had this lovely reception with wine and cheese, and now we're going to have a conversation about a very serious subject, right? The Vietnam War. I teach a course at the University of Maryland on the 1960s. My class has 240 students in it this semester, so it would fill this room. It's a very popular course. It has a big waiting list. That's not because of me, but it's because of the topic. My students are fascinated by the 1960s, even though they're too young, obviously, to have lived through it. And in fact, their parents are too young to have been activists in the 1960s. Not to make you cringe a little bit. And so they come to this class filled with questions. And so I hope that you feel comfortable interrupting me. They interrupt me all the time. Feel free. And one of the things we just finished doing, we spent a 6-week unit working on the social movements of the 1960s, right? The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the farm workers, right? Every kind of movement you can imagine. And the one we end with is the anti-war movement. And to be honest, it's the one they're least interested in until we start talking about it, because they feel like they know what it is, right? People didn't want the war. And what they don't realize is that the anti-war movement is the movement that brought all the other movements together, right? That this was the place that united all kinds of Americans in their opposition to the war. And so one of the things that makes the anti-war movement so interesting to historians is finding these places of convergence, of coalition, where Americans work together. The other reason my students are so interested in this topic is that it feels like they're seeing it again. That this was a moment in American history that was incredibly divisive, right? That they look back and they see the kind of politicization of all kinds of cultural events. They see the kind of angry politics in the streets, and they see parallels to today. So I wanted to talk about the anti-war movement and what it means, right, to contemporary students in 2018. This is a great place, in fact, to talk about the anti-war movement. Excuse me, I'm sure as many of you know, because your county had one of the most important anti-war demonstrations. In 1971, the Camden 28, which I understand is a topic that will be covered in this lecture series in December, right? Is that right? Yeah, December. You should come back for that one, right? 28 activists, the Camden 28, planned to break into a local draft board and destroy the draft records of the 1A, God bless you, the 1A young men who are going to be drafted to go into the war. This case is important for lots of reasons. I'm sure the speakers will talk about this in December. The trial itself is very important. But the reason I start with it, actually, is not just because it's a local story, but because it helps us remember how the anti-war movement is thought of and misremembered. The Camden 28 story happens in 1971. In a lot of traditional stories about the anti-war movement kind of disappears by 1970. The draft has changed, Nixon's bringing the troops home, and the idea is that the anti-war movement is over. In fact, the Camden 28 tells us it's not. The Camden 28 also tells us that the draft wasn't the only issue people cared about. It was important, but it wasn't the only thing. And the Camden 28 example tells us that this wasn't just a movement of students. These were ministers and priests, these were auto workers and social workers, all kinds of people opposed the Vietnam War. And so that is part of what I want to talk about how these coalitions came together, when they worked and when they didn't, the kind of complexity of the anti-war movement. Excuse me. So this instance, right, the anti-war movement, is a little hard for historians to define. In some ways, we can very easily point to the civil rights movement, right, or the women's movement. But the anti-war movement is a little trickier because people came to the anti-war movement for different reasons. And it was a global movement. We forget that sometimes because we focus on US history. But there were protests all over Europe, in New Zealand and Australia, in parts of the Middle East to try to end the Vietnam War. And of course, there were protests in Vietnam as well. In fact, historians debate this a lot. Can we even say that there was one anti-war movement? Maybe there were multiple movements. Maybe they overlapped. Right? Maybe these people didn't have that much in common with each other except the fact that they didn't like this war. That's an interesting question, right? And I'd like to come back to that towards the end. What we can say, right, because there's amazing polling in the 1960s, is that most Americans disapproved of the war by 1968. And that's true across all kinds of demographic boundaries. Excuse me. So just to give you a snapshot of what this looks like, the Gallup company, along with lots of other polling companies based at universities, polled constantly on the war. In fact, Gallup polled Americans 4 times a year about what they were thinking about the war. And so we have an immense amount of data on American feelings about the war. And some of this is surprising to contemporary audiences. And so one of the things we know is that people who don't have a college degree, they tend to be more likely to oppose the war than college students. That surprises a lot of my students, right? They think of the anti-war movement as a student movement. But in fact, a lot of working class people really disapproved of what was happening in Southeast Asia. We know that opposition stretched across all kinds of demographic lines, that both Republicans and Democrats opposed the war by 1969, that a majority of Americans in rural areas and small towns and cities opposed the war, that every region had opposition to the war, and every income level. So this is a huge amount of opposition in the United States to this foreign policy decisions being made in Washington. That doesn't mean, though, that all of these people who opposed the war supported the anti-war movement. And it was possible for them to hold both ideas in their heads, that they disliked the war, but they also disliked the movement. And so we find surprising polling, right, that a majority of Americans disapprove of the war, but even more of them disapprove of the anti-war movement. This is hard to reconcile in some respects, right? My students are baffled by this. In part, it's because of the way the anti-war movement appears on American television sets every night. They only get snapshots of the anti-war movement. They see pictures of screaming students and bomb throwers, and they miss the kind of complex diversity of the anti-war movement. So holding both of these ideas at the same time is important to understand that there was widespread disapproval of the war, but not everyone actually supported the anti-war movement. In part, it's because of what they see. So for example, some of you may remember this, right? In 1968, the Yippies, this kind of radical group of the counterculture, decide that neither of the candidates running for president is acceptable to them, and so in fact they nominate a pig called Pegasus to run for president, right? That turns off a lot of Americans who otherwise would have sympathized with them. They see this as silly, right? These kind of long-haired, bearded radicals on the TV news who are doing these funny street art performances, and they can't get behind the movement. This is unusual, right? In American history, most times if you oppose the cause, you join the movement to stop it. It's not true during the anti-war movement. And so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about why various groups of Americans oppose the war. Because it's not simple to say that they just wanted the war to stop. depending on who you were, you had different reasons for your opposition. So let me walk you through some examples, right? Some general demographic examples. This is Martin Luther King in his famous Riverside Church lecture, his seminar, in April of 1967. King is rather late in the civil rights community to come out against the war. SNCC, the student group, had come out against the war 15 months earlier. But King is convinced by Johnson not to do it, not to come out publicly. But he finally does so in the spring of 1967 because he sees images of children in Vietnam who've been disfigured by napalm and feels like he can no longer stay silent. So he goes to Riverside Church up in New York City, not his own congregation, right, Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, but a church of wealthy white liberals in New York City to publicly come out against the war. And here's how he describes his opposition. He says, I come out against the war because of what it's doing to the poor. I come out against the war because it's unfair to African Americans in this country. I come out against the war because we don't have democracy at home and we're trying to create a democracy in Southeast Asia. None of these things have to do with the draft. It was that the anti-war movement and the people in the movement had much wider critiques of what was happening in Southeast Asia than just the draft. The Camden 28 also have really complex reasons for coming out against the war, right? Now, obviously, their action is geared towards a draft office, and so they're talking about the draft. But when they explain what they're doing, right, why they're doing this, they say this is madness of the arms race. In other words, putting it in this larger Cold War context, that there's something wrong generally in our foreign policy, and that we've neglected our cities and our prisons. In other words, that we're spending all this money overseas and nothing here at home. So they have these complex, critical ideas about the war that don't get filtered through the press. This isn't what the press talks about. This isn't what people see on the nightly news. So opposition really runs this big gamut in the 1960s and early 1970s. And sometimes they're purely philosophical objections. Paul Potter, in the first anti-war march in 1965, describes the system that's creating wars like Vietnam. But others are making really pragmatic considerations. I don't want my son to go over there and die. Right? I don't want my husband to be sent overseas. Reconciling both of these things within a single movement is hard. It's difficult. And in part, right, the anti-war movement is coming out of a tradition in American history of peace activism. There was a long history of peace activism in the United States. Excuse me, Jane Addams had organized against World War I, right, in the United States. Those organizations are still around. And lots of famous Americans come out against the war pretty early because they had been aligned with the peace movements. They had criticisms of the war that don't have to do with Vietnam specifically. They're worried about nuclearization. Right? They're worried about the Cold War. They're worried about what it means to be always at war in the 1950s and 1960s. Then we see civil rights activists coming out against the war in pretty clear language, saying that this isn't my war. I'm not going over there to fight for things I don't have at home. That these people, right, are not my enemy in South Vietnam or in North Vietnam. I'm not going to be the ones fighting them. Excuse me. Part of this has to do with a philosophical disagreement with the war, and part of it's really pragmatic, that African Americans were more likely to be drafted than whites before 1969, and they're disproportionately likely to die because they serve in the front lines. And so the critiques of the war kind of depend on who you are, right? Do you come out of the peace movement? Do you come out of civil rights? Why do you oppose the war? Some of the critiques have to do with what's happening here at home, really kind of home front issues. So we can see here a protest that connects Head Start and the war. Right? That funding, they're saying, for this really important program for pre-K education is being starved by the war effort. We're spending only pennies on Head Start, but billions for bombs. This is sometimes described in like high school textbooks as Lyndon Johnson's guns or butter dilemma, right? That Johnson runs into this situation by 1967 that he can't fund both the war and all of his Great Society programs equally. And what the great cartoonists, right, especially Herb Bloch in the 60s portray is that the war gets all the money, right? And US urban needs are kind of left behind in rags. Here's another example, again, from Herb Bloch. You can see here health, education, and welfare just trying to belly up to the bar, right? Not even reaching over the top. So some of the critiques about the war are not about the war itself, but about what funding decisions the Congress and the administration are making in the 1960s. Other critiques come from corners that are a bit unexpected. Many business leaders come out against the war by 1968 because they're worried about what it's doing to the US economy. The post-war economy had been the strongest in American history, but all the economic indicators by 1968 are pointing in the wrong direction. And they blame the war, right? Johnson has cut taxes, but he's spending and spending and spending. And so business leaders come together and they decide to ask the administration to stop funding this war. That's not about Vietnam in particular, right? It's not about a moral cause or a philosophy. It's about dollars and cents. But they're part of the anti-war movement too. Some people oppose the war because of the way the war is being waged. It's not the philosophy of the government or the goals of our foreign policy overall, but they disapprove of the way the US is waging this war in Southeast Asia, on a poor, small nation in Southeast Asia. They disapprove of the weapons like napalm, or the use of chemical agents like Agent Orange, of tactics like Zippo raids, which you can see here in the background of this photo. And a lot of these critiques come from returning veterans. They say, I was over there, I saw what we were doing, I'm a member of the US military, and I have a right to talk about what's going on in Southeast Asia. They feel like they have a place of authority to talk about the war. And their critique is about what's happening, what they witness and what they do in the war. This is probably most famous in the My Lai incident, right, in 1968, which doesn't become known to most of the US public for another year and a half, but is captured in a series of really wrenching testimonies over several days in a Howard Johnson. I remember Howard Johnson's, right? In a Howard Johnson in Detroit, where they get hundreds of veterans to come up there and for hour after hour after hour talk about what they experienced and record these testimonies of these kind of gruesome war stories to say that My Lai was not isolated, that these kinds of behaviors were happening all over the country, and that they had seen it, right? They had witnessed this. Their testimonies, right, are filled with kind of agony about what happened over in Vietnam and why they now feel compelled to speak up, to try to stop the war, right? And it's about the kind of, God bless you, the depersonalization that they experience over there, the violence, this feeling like, what are we doing, right? What are we accomplishing for our nation? How are we making things safe? And so their critiques, right, are different. They're different than what the civil rights movement activists are saying. They're different than what's coming out of the business community. All of these different populations have different reasons for opposing the war. It's not just the draft. Right? The draft matters, and it becomes a focus of a lot of the conversations about the war, but it's not just the draft. The draft is a question that my students find fascinating because they didn't live through it, right? And they have lots of questions about how the draft worked, and they always want to know about the mechanisms. And when I explain it to them, they think it's bonkers, right? And especially understanding that the draft changes in 1969. So first, figuring out the early system and the way the early system discriminated against certain populations, right? If you had a friend who was friend with your father on the draft board, he could get you out, right? If you went to college with somebody's son on the draft board, he could get you out. And so those early critiques of the draft are really about the unfairness, right? That college-age students and the rich found ways to escape service. And then the draft changes, right, in 1969 to the draft lottery. Somebody here was mentioning that, I'm sorry, out in the hall. Yeah, you, right, your husband, right, you're saying, right. So, and this way becomes kind of a crapshoot, right? You don't know. It's based on your birthday, and you can see here, right, they're pulling the birth dates out of this giant jar like it's a lottery. And that was the date you went. Nixon promises the draft is going to be more fair this way, and it is sort of, but people hate it, right? All the polling shows that they feel like this is a crazy system, and there's even more opposition to the draft after 1969. So the draft becomes this really kind of important question to the movement because it seems unfair no matter the way that it's organized. Here's the thing. So right, all these people oppose the war, all these different reasons. The anti-war movement also had a vast diversity of tactics along a huge spectrum. We can talk about political activism, things like running campaigns and lobbying and petitioning, peaceful activism, like vigils or peaceful demonstrations, and then at the other end, there are all these radical actions, right? Bombings. All of these things somehow, to historians, fit in the same movement. That seems a little strange, right? I'm gonna come back to that at the end. But let me walk you through the kind of spectrum of what the anti-war movement looked like. The most political campaigns were probably things done by people in the parties or by business executives. So this is the Business Executives Group, BEM. They would do things like pay for a speakers bureau. Right? So they would pay Tom Hayden to go around the country, or Daniel Ellsberg, to talk to community groups, to talk to college campuses, and explain why we should stop the war. They organize letter writing campaigns, or they pay for radio ads or newspaper ads. They would fundraise for candidates who promised to stop the war. So this is a kind of traditional political organizing, right? And there was a lot of that in the anti-war movement, but it makes for really boring television. Right? Nobody wants to see this on television, and so this doesn't show up. But this is probably the majority of anti-war activism. The majority isn't marching on Washington, right? It's not bombing the Pentagon. It's this stuff, but it's not sexy. Then we get these kind of educational campaigns, right? Teach-ins. I don't know if any of you have ever gone to a teach-in. We run teach-ins on my campus too, right? The idea here, excuse me, in kind of the spring of '65, was that graduate students and faculty would talk to the public, talk to students about the war, and tell them why it was the wrong thing, why it was the wrong decision for the US government. And there was a kind of naive optimism in the teach-ins, right? As though if you just educated people, if you relieve them of their ignorance, they would immediately come out against the war. And the teach-ins, right, especially by the fall of '65, start to seem like they're preaching to the choir, right? That everybody in the audience already agrees with these people, and there's no one left to convert. But there's a kind of faith in education among a lot of activists, because they're people like me, right? They're educators or students. And so they want to think about how to educate people and get them to change their minds about the war. So we have this kind of traditional political organizing, we've got education campaigns, and then we get demonstrations, kind of peaceful demonstrations in early 1965. And just to put this in some sort of context, right, in your kind of Vietnam War timeline, this is really early. So the first big protest down on Washington happens excuse me, in April of '65. US ground troops appear in Vietnam in March of '65. So it's only a month afterwards, right? Operation Rolling Thunder, the air campaign, had started in February of '65. So the anti-war movement happens alongside the war almost immediately. They had expected maybe, hopefully, 2,000 people to show up for the first anti-war demonstration in April, and they get 25,000. They're thrilled, right? And kind of amazed by the outrage almost immediately about what's happening over in Southeast Asia. But for a couple years, it feels like they're not getting anywhere, right? We have protests, we have teach-ins, we have letter writing campaigns, and nothing's changing. And so some of the movement organizers decide we need to get more radical. We need different kinds of protests. And this is where we see a few individuals We think the number is somewhere around 24. It's a little hard to capture entirely. Self-immolations. And what they're doing here is borrowing, obviously, right, from the Vietnamese monks who had self-immolated in the streets of Saigon. And we see students. George Wynn is a student at San Diego State. Alice Hers is 87, right? She sits down in the center of Detroit and lights herself on fire. This here is Norm Morrison, who's a Quaker, obviously. He sat down with his baby in front of the Pentagon and set himself on fire. His child is saved, in case you're wondering. He doesn't make it, but his child is saved. There's lots of these happening, right? And the idea here is we need to make people pay attention. How do we dramatize what's happening thousands of miles away? How do we get them to care? And so what these activists were doing is the ultimate sacrifice, self-immolation. This is a description of one of the self-immolations in Los Angeles, Florence Beaumont, who's a mother of two. This is her husband, right? And he says he wants to make it clear to people, right? This is not suicide. This is a political act. She sat down and she killed herself so that people would pay attention, that they would think of the consequences of this war, right? That this was not something that only happens 9,000 miles away, that we need to pay attention to it because it affects us too. This gets a lot of attention, right? More attention than a bunch of geeky history professors talking to a classroom about the war. This starts people thinking. It draws media attention. And so some of the movement activists start saying, how do we capitalize on this, right? How do we capture this energy and this attention? And how do we make a real difference? They come up with this slogan, protest to resistance. A big shift that happens in 67 and 68. And the idea is we're not just going to protest the war anymore. We're going to actively resist it. We're going to stop the mechanisms of the war machine from operating. We're going to throw our body on the gears, right, to use Mario Savio's language. We're going to stop the war machine from operating. And so this idea, right, this tactic is where the anti-war movement becomes more radicalized and where it starts losing some sympathy, right? A lot of these activists had experience in the civil rights movement. They had seen what worked and didn't work in the South, and they were convinced that more dramatic action had to be used in order to stop the war from going. This is when we start seeing more active draft resistance, right? Publicly burning your draft card. That's an example of resistance, right? Not just protesting the draft, but stopping the draft from functioning, right? Breaking into draft boards. Excuse me. And there's lots of ways to resist the draft, lots and lots of ways. This is just an example. I mean, obviously the simplest way to resist the draft is just not to register, which lots of people did. You could destroy your draft card. You could just declare that you were a conscientious objector. I'll talk about that in a second. You could try to leave the country, or you could resist, right? Stop the draft from happening. This is one example of that. In October of 1967, Stop the Draft Week, which was based in California, but it happened all across the country, found ways to stop the draft mechanism from working. So for example, in Oakland, what we see are people standing on the train tracks to stop the troop trains from leaving the army base to get to the coast, right? To get on airplanes and go over to Vietnam. In other places, they would sit down and prevent people from walking into induction centers, like literally stopping the draft from happening. The idea behind burning a draft card, right, is a political act. You don't do this in private, right, in your living room. You do it in public, right, to make a symbol of your resistance. And draft evasion, like I said, is kind of complicated, and we don't know exactly how many people evaded the draft. In 1978, Carter, quite controversially, decides to pardon the draft evaders. And so he asks this commission to investigate how many people need pardons. And they come up with a list of about 200,000 names. Historians think the number is probably closer to 570,000. That's quite a bit different, right? And it's partly because they're hard to track. Right? A lot of this was happening underground, and people weren't making public noises about their draft evasion. The imagination is that all these people like put on backpacks and headed up into Canada, right? But that's actually not true. Right? Certainly today, that's not true. It wasn't true even in the 60s. Canada didn't want all these people. And it's hard to enter Canada, actually, harder than you think. In the 1960s, excuse me, more draft evaders, we think, actually went to Mexico than Canada, even though Canada is the popular imagination of what happened to the evaders. And then a lot of men, and these were not captured under Carter's 200,000, tried to declare as COs, as conscientious objectors, to say, I don't want to be part of this war. This is a difficult decision for a lot of men to make, because if you got CO status, you didn't necessarily find yourself exempted from service. You just found yourself exempted from service on the front lines. So you still may have been a medic or a cook, and for a lot of men, that wasn't acceptable, right? That they were still helping the war machine to operate if they were aiding the military in any way. And so many of them went and tried to get out of the war altogether. And the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. The Supreme Court tells men that you can't object to one war in particular, like the Vietnam War, that in fact you have to serve in some way if you're drafted. But this is an option for some men, right? An attempt to evade the draft. Then we get these more radical examples of resistance, right? Most famously, protests on college campuses, at banks, and at government agencies, trying to stop Dow Chemical from creating napalm, right? From the military recruiting students on campus. This is perhaps the most famous example of this. At the University of Wisconsin, an anti-war group decided to destroy the mathematics center. And one researcher died. He wasn't supposed to be in the building. The bomb went off at 3:30 in the morning. They thought the building was going to be empty, but unfortunately somebody died. This turns a lot of people off, right? They oppose the war, but they don't want to be blowing up buildings. This feels like it doesn't fit. The most radical, of course, is the Weather Underground, who bombs the Pentagon and the US Capitol, along with lots of other places, right? And the radicalism of the Weather Underground turns a lot of people away from the anti-war movement, even if they sympathize with the idea of ending the war itself. I think we should remember, though, that those radicals weren't just students. It wasn't just these kind of crazy leftist students from Columbia and Berkeley. The Catonsville Nine, which is just outside Baltimore, Catonsville, Maryland, they were Catholic priests and middle-aged parents who went into the draft board there, stole the records, and burned them with homemade napalm. They got the recipe from the Special Forces Handbook. It was like this radicalism wasn't just happening among students, it was happening with middle-class people, with middle-aged people, with the radical clerical left. And it's all over the country. Right? I just picked a handful here, but there are scores and scores of these groups, like the Camden 28, who went in and stole documents, right, or destroyed draft boards. Yeah.
A question about priests protesting.
Yeah, sure.
Did the Pope make any public comments
Yes.
about opposition to the war that
Yes.
spurred him on, or was he kind of
No. He disapproved of this. The Pope disapproved of this activism. The Berrigan brothers are actually defrocked.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I went to a Catholic high school, and I had a Catholic priest teaching me religion, and he had a unique way of telling us how to avoid the draft. He recommended, if you want to avoid the draft, one of his suggestions was commit a felony.
Yes.
Commit a felony, you cannot be drafted. And he said the mildest felony he knows was to kill an eagle. That's a felony. He said, go kill an eagle, it's a felony, and you won't get drafted. That was his recommendation.
That's pretty great advice, and I'm going to use that in my class next week. But yes, I'm surprised that the priest in your high school recommended committing a felony. The official Catholic hierarchy opposed this activism. Yeah. As far as, I think Father Doyle's coming here in December, right? He can talk a little bit about that, but he does retain his clerical collar, but in kind of complicated ways. But yeah, the Berrigan brothers, who are both Catholic priests, they're defrocked. And all of these groups became famous in the 1960s and 1970s because a lot of them made sure that people knew who they were. They weren't hiding. They raided these offices, the FBI, the draft offices, laboratories. They were hit and stay activists. They wanted people to recognize who they were. They're willing to take responsibility for what they had done. It's hard to fit them in with the political opposition, right? These kind of mild-mannered guys who are running for Congress or organizing for anti-war campaigns, and this is kind of a famous example. Some of you may remember Eugene McCarthy, right, running for the presidency in 1968. He asked all these student radicals who had long hair and beards to get clean for Gene, right, to cut their hair and shave their beards. How do we fit them into the same movement as people who are blowing up labs? That's hard for historians, right? And we think that's why it was so hard to define the anti-war movement for people at the time. It was that what they shared across this kind of vast demographic boundaries, these vast tactics and reasons for opposition, was really just that they wanted to stop the war, and that nothing else really unites them. There's no other way to define it. They just wanted the hell out of Vietnam. For historians, that's so frustrating, right? We want dues-paying members and a central organization and a leader that we can point to. But Vietnam didn't work that way. The anti-war movement just didn't function in that way. And so in some ways, I think that the anti-Vietnam War protest is incredibly instructive in ways for future organizing, that it shows us the importance of coalition organizing. This was a vast movement that lasts almost a decade. And in order for that to happen, you had to have creativity. You had to have this kind of fractured alliances that was able to shift tactics and shift rationales. This is more long-lasting than most of the 60s social movements, in part because of who's part of it, right? That they have found ways to shape the movement to reflect their own needs. I think the anti-war movement also matters because it can tell us how the political debate was shaped in that era in ways they couldn't control, like Jane Fonda, right? I'm getting back to Fonda in just one second. And I think probably most importantly, and this is gonna be my final point, is that the anti-war movement matters because it was so important to so many individuals, that it really demonstrated to them their own power, right? That they had a voice that could be heard. And so when I talk to my students and they say the 60s was this moment of great division, of fighting, polarization, I try to point to the anti-war movement as this moment where all these groups actually came together. That there are very few other places where we can see women's activists and civil rights activists and the farm workers and the unions and business executives and the clergy, right, all together working for the same goal. In some ways, it's really fascinating to historians to see those intersections and to think about the ways they worked. The other thing that's so interesting to us, right, historians, but I think should be interesting to the rest of the country, is the way the movements learned from each other. And so what we start seeing all throughout the late 1960s, but especially 1968, is how movement activists borrowed from one another, learned from one another. And so we see these protests with these really interesting signs that indicate I'm opposed to racism, right, but I also don't want the war. Or, excuse me, this is one of my favorites, right? I'm for gay liberation, but I also want to get out of the war effort. These seem like they should be two separate protests. But for people in the movement, it made sense, right, that they're all together because they're all a kind of critique of the power structure of the United States in the 1960s. That Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and African Americans and white kids from Berkeley could all be part of the same movement. Excuse me. And some of these movements directly taught anti-war activists how to do this, right? The CNVA is the kind of long-standing peace movement in the United States. It's been around since the turn of the century. And Women's Strike for Peace had been around since the end of World War II. They literally taught activists like how to do this, right? Here's how you create pamphlets, and here's how you circulate them, and here's how you get a permit to have a protest. That you need to learn those things somewhere from someone. That, excuse me, civil rights activists, right, taught people in the anti-war movement, here's how you get the media to come to your protest, right? Here's how you use the language of criticism to draw in supporters. They're learning from one another, quite literally. And they're also drawing really important counter-protests. This story kind of gets lost a little bit. But the opposition to the anti-war movement was so huge that we get a funny phenomenon called the anti-war movement, which makes no sense at all to my students sometimes. But these were not people who necessarily supported the war, which that double negative seems like it should indicate. These were people who did not like the anti-war movement. And most famously, we get this big protest down on Wall Street right after the Kent State shootings, right? Where we get these guys in hard hats who identify themselves as members of the AFL-CIO attacking student protesters. And they say, we don't like your protests, right? We don't like the way you look. We don't like you out on the streets. We don't like what you're saying. And so the anti-war movement, right, it finds a lot at fault with the anti-war movement. They see the anti-war movement as unpatriotic, right? That they're undermining American authority abroad and the American administrations at home. So this is kind of a famous example, right, of Jane Fonda, who still gets used constantly in all of these campaigns. And they would share these stories that simply weren't true, right? This is one you've probably heard a lot. There's all these stories about soldiers coming home and being spit on in airports. Never happened. Never happened. Never happened. There are at least 3 books out about this. I can give you the titles. Never happened. We've never been able to find anyone who can give an oral history testimony of this. It's never covered in any popular press at the time, no newspaper coverage, no television coverage. Never happened. But everyone thinks it did, right? There was no big parade down Madison Avenue. And so the anti-war movement says, this is what you've done, right? You've kind of destroyed our patriotism. There were hundreds of parades for returning veterans. They weren't down Madison Avenue, but they were down major city streets in other cities. But the picture, right, the kind of control that the anti-war movement has is that they paint the anti-war movement as unpatriotic, right? And that was shocking to a lot of people in the movement because they felt like they were anything but unpatriotic, that they were standing up for American values at home and abroad. So we continue to debate this, right? We debate and debate and debate about the anti-war movement. And one thing that always happens at the end of my lecture with my students is, did it matter? In other words, did it end the war? Does anyone want to say anything about that? Do you think it ended the war faster? Did it prolong the war?
Put pressure on Johnson to end the war.
Okay.
We talk about it all the time.
So Nixon and Johnson both publicly and privately talk about how irritated they are by the street protests, right, and the political pressure they feel. So do you all think the anti-war movement ended the war early? Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes.
Just said by the same token, the VC recognized what was going on in America. And
Okay.
use that as their thing.
So the other side says this exactly, right? That the folks in North Vietnam saw the anti-war protests and realized that they could keep fighting because eventually Johnson or Nixon, depending on when it was, were going to give up, right? And so they argue that the anti-war movement actually prolonged the war by giving aid and comfort to the enemy. So that was a contemporary argument. Yes, sir.
The fact that silence would have meant consent
Yeah.
to the war would have prolonged the effort
Yes.
more than anything.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. What if we had said?
So-
What if
so-
no one had stood up?
Right. It would have gone on until
Yeah.
we had just
Yeah.
exhausted ourselves.
I will say that people, historians in my field, we find this impossible to answer. Right? There's no way to measure it. In part because it's a counter-argument. We're trying to guess what would have happened in the absence of the anti-war movement. Yeah.
Compared to other wars before and after.
Sure.
Like, there's not like war in Iraq. There was not very widespread
No.
protest, not aggressive protest, not nationwide protest, not media
No.
coverage to any great extent.
Yeah.
And you think that makes the difference in the length of the war? I would say there were protests as strong as that. I would think things would have
Yeah. That's the argument, right? That it was a unique moment, right, of activism, of people on the streets. But then again, the war doesn't end until 73, right? I mean, that's an 8-year war. It's a long time. Sorry, you were going to say something? Yeah, and he actually expands the war, right? He expands the war into Cambodia and Laos. Yep, as a pro-war candidate, right? What else? Sir? Yeah, that's one argument.
A lot of the focus in 1968 was because there was a draft, and they were
Yeah.
drafting.
But the protests go on after the draft ends, right?
But it did end in 1968.
Right. Oh, sir.
Another issue related to now versus then preparing any war today is the fact that the media is largely left out of the conversation today. As a kid, my whole memory is every night watching that war, casualties, American boys
Yeah.
being loaded up on helicopters,
Sure.
various.
And it was unfiltered, it was blush.
Yeah, I mean, people.
We
Yeah.
don't let the media in. It's a very
Right.
sterile view of it. So you
Yeah.
can't even compare today to then in terms of our reaction because we don't get the same information. We were right there.
People remember Vietnam as the first television war, right? That it was in their living rooms. Although there's some studies that's a little bit exaggerated. I just want to say, I'm going to open this up again, just to say one last thing. This question was hotly debated in the 1990s, which some of you will remember, not you guys up in the corner, right? But especially around the 1992 presidential debate, right? When Bill Clinton's running for president. And a lot of the conversation was about whether or not Clinton had dodged the draft, right? Whether he was a draft evader. And again, a little bit less so, but in 2000 when George W. Bush is running, there's a question about whether or not he'd done this. And the answer is actually slightly different by people on the right in the 1990s. You might think that this was the answer they give, right? That they prolong the war, because that's what people on the right said in the 60s and 70s. In fact, they say that the anti-war movement was effective, that it did end the war early, and that's why we lost. It wasn't the military that lost, right? It was our political leaders who gave in and ended the war too early. So you can see, right, depending on when you ask this question, you get different answers. For the last 15 years, historians have had access to archives in Vietnam that we didn't have access to before. And we can now say, rather definitively, that this did not matter to the Vietnamese. They knew what was happening, and they would sometimes drag things out at the peace table, right, between elections, but they were never, ever, ever going to give up, right? And so this question really becomes about how Americans understand the anti-war movement, right? And what we talk about when we talk about the anti-war movement, about whether or not we lost, right? Or the military lost, or what it does to people at home. And so for me, what's so interesting about the anti-war movement is talking to people who were part of it. Because what they say is, whether or not we ended the war, I felt like my voice was heard. And this gave me a sense of empowerment to go out and do something. And I got engaged in politics, right? And that crosses all kinds of interesting boundaries. And so for me, that's the real legacy of the anti-war movement. Not whether or not it ended the war, but what it did to the American populace. So that's it. I'm open for questions, comments. Yes, sir?
I have a few points.
Sure, go ahead.
One, as it relates to the effectiveness of the first really televised war, I think as somebody who lived through it, we recognized that this was going on and started disbelieving what our government was
Yes.
telling us. Because they were telling us the lights at the end of the tunnel,
Right.
everything's, and every night you sat in the room and say, the lights at the end of the tunnel, it's a locomotive that's heading down.
Yeah, this is the famous credibility gap, right? That we don't believe the government anymore, right? There's a space between what they tell us and the truth. The credibility gap.
Sort of summarized it when he in a statement so everybody can hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So this gentleman here was talking about the fact that when you watch the news every night, you see a different picture than what the government officials are telling you. Right.
The second point, that I think you can undervalue the resistance to the somebody
Yeah.
to get into the National Guard.
I
You
mean,
had
yes.
a bone spur.
Yes, I was going to use that example.
You wouldn't get it. So it was still being fought by,
Yes.
well, and I guess
Yeah.
the way I would put it is, does anybody think that if we had a draft, we'd be in Afghanistan for 17 years?
Right. No, I mean, and
No question in anybody's mind.
there's a lot of discussion about that, right? I mean, my colleagues who study Middle Eastern history talk about this a lot. You know, that less than 1% of Americans now are connected to someone who served in Iraq or in Afghanistan. If you looked at that number in the 60s, that number would be much, much higher, right? More people knew or related to someone who served overseas. And today that number is very small, or was supposed to.
And my third
Right.
goes to the anti-war
Yeah.
protest. That, I think, was a generational thing going on. It was the idea
Well,
that the protesters,
These guys are pretty young.
the protesters were the young, long-haired people taking place during the sexual revolution in this
yeah.
country, which I think cannot be underestimated. The people with the hard hats was, what are they doing to my country?
Yeah, I think that part of it is that, the sense that these young kids are out of control, right? But there were a lot of young people in the anti-war movement. This is a picture of a guy, right, saying win in Vietnam. And they, you know, they're organized in groups like the Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF, right? These kind of conservative groups on campus that didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but became hugely important because they trained the leaders who came to power in the 1970s and 1980s. But this was their kind of foundational experience, feeling like they were left out. Yes, sir. This one's early.
Yes, exactly.
This is 70.
The first big buildup in Vietnam was February of 1965. The war was barely started.
And yet, right, but we see that, I'm sorry, I should have picked pictures from 68, but we see the same things on college campuses, that people are coming out in support of the war on campuses, mostly organized in the YAF. Sir, yes.
I have to take exception to what you said as far as returned veterans
Yeah.
not being spit upon or things like that. I don't know if anybody personally spit upon, but I also know I was one who came home, one of my best, well, probably one of my best friends turned against me completely because he went in reserves and he just didn't think it was right. Not that I wanted to go when I got drafted, but, you know, and also I ran into a number of other incidents. The only traffic ticket I ever got in my life was a very minor offense right outside of Fort Dix. And generally speaking, police will respect the military, but at that time, there was very little respect for the military.
I think that's true. I mean, I think we have certainly evidence of servicemen being called terrible names, right? Baby killer, right? You would hear that sometimes at protests in the late 1960s. But some of the organized campaigns, right, that show up in popular culture, that we don't have any evidence of that.
Yeah, that I don't know as far as funerals, like I ran in Iraq, you know, some of those men, when they came back for funerals, Iraq, and there were demonstrations. I personally don't know of any, but unfortunately, I had to go to a lot of these funerals when I did come home. But I don't recall any demonstrations there. But it was a very unpopular war.
Yes.
A lot of people made it very personal.
It was absolutely personal, right? Especially for people in the same generation, right? The same generational cohort. You know, so if you came of age in 1968 and your brother came of age in 1972, or if you're only 4 years younger, he had a vastly different experience of the war than you did, right?
Another institutional bias against veterans. My wife just reminded me, I refused to use State Farm insurance. The time I was 16, I had State Farm insurance. Left for Vietnam, I dropped my insurance. I came back, first day home, went for insurance. State Farm refused to take it. Why? Because their answer was, you have not been insured for the last year. Guess what?
Right.
They're going to insure me anyhow.
Yeah, those insurance companies.
Yeah, I had to go in to sign this program. They got me up one year. I have never been back to them.
All right. Oh, I have my renter's insurance with them. Yes, sir.
Two things if I can.
Sure.
And the first is, I'm a veteran of Vietnam. One of the things that people do today, or a lot of us do today, is if you see someone that's got a hat on or something like that, you shake their hand and you say, welcome home.
Yeah, sure.
And the reason people do that is no one ever said that to us. The second thing, it's about people who came back. I ended up at Fort Dix and I got assigned to a weird unit called the Special Processing Detachment. But what happened in the 30 days or more and get picked up, they'd return you to the nearest post. So if you went AWOL from Fort Hood, Texas, and you got picked up in Medford, New Jersey, you ended up in Fort Dix. We used to get 5 buses a week, one a day from New York City with 10, 12 people on it who were being brought back from AWOL. You get 3 a week from Philadelphia who were
Yeah.
coming back. Round numbers, 7,500 people a year.
Yeah, there were huge numbers of desertions.
Huge problem. And
Yeah.
part of it was nobody was really equipped, the military, anybody else, to deal with these guys. And a lot of them got repeated violations, a lot of them got bad conduct discharges. It was really a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah. Well, and as I'm sure both of you can demonstrate, I mean, morale in the military by 1968 and 69 was quite low, right? So I think that contributed to the desertions. Yeah. Yes, sir. Just like Sonny Bono here.
Doc, I just want to affirm that, a lot of stuff you presented tonight is dead on. I lived through this whole period. I was working class, South Jersey, got drafted in March of 1966.
Whew, early.
My dad was working in Canada, and I visited him right before I reported, and he told me, stay here, don't go back. But I didn't listen to him. I said I couldn't do that. My girlfriend lived in Cherryville. So anyway, I came back, and I got drafted. I went in, I went to Vietnam. I did my year there, and when I came back, I came here for my first year. I went to college. I was determined I was going to get an education and a degree, so I came here. I joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, wore an armband, marched on campus, and I'm very proud that I did that because I felt no other kid should be armed. And my father-in-law was Archie Bunker, and he was very upset. He was a Marine Corps World War II veteran.
Yeah, I mean, I think your experience demonstrates this
I did the
divided
right thing.
families.
So thanks, Jack. I missed that whole hippie thing. I had a shaved head. And at least for one night, I'm a hippie.
One of the things that I sort of missed in your presentation was the very argument against the justification of the war. And I felt that a lot of kids were unconvinced of any
Yes.
justifiable reason
Yes.
for this war that
Yes, it was immoral or unjust, right?
a little different than the no war ever. people.
Right.
And they got hurt with the Arab-Israeli conflict because they found a war that they felt they could justify, and that drained their energies from the arguments.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, one of the things I try to do in my class is decenter the draft, even though I know that was a definitive experience, because a lot of people oppose the war for reasons more than the draft, right? That it was this kind of critique of U.S. foreign policy around the world, what it was doing. There's somebody up here. Oh, yes.
I'm interested in this slide that you ended on, which is about a generation of people to believe their actions matter. I am a Gen X daughter of a baby boomer mom and I grew up with your generation is not politically motivated.
Yes, I
not
got that
any
too.
of these things. I wonder if you have any, if you can talk a little bit about that shift.
Yeah.
And why, I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I think that does come up in the literature too, the sense that, the boomers were active, out in the streets and fighting for social justice, and their kids, played video games and, bought a lot of stuff in the 80s, right? We were consumer kids. I'm not quite sure that fits, though. I think a lot of us, I speak, as a Gen Xer, right? We're kind of inspired by our parents' generation and thought about what we could do in the world. And those solutions were maybe a little different than these, right? Because our problems were different, right? So I think about anti-apartheid activism in the 1980s, right? Which borrowed some of what was happening here in the 60s, but thought seriously, for example, about how to use economic leverage to change the regime in South Africa. So it looked a little different, I think. But I think you're right that we do get kind of criticized for not being political. Right.
Necessarily disagreeing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And my students hear that all the time. They're like, oh, millennials, all you care about is your phone, right? But they're really active. They're very interested in what's happening around the world. Yeah.
I'm one of those indifferent people.
Okay. In the
I wasn't
60s?
for the war, I was not against the war.
That's very unusual.
I was working 2 jobs, pulled myself through college. When they did, it was a Glassboro State, they tried to have a protest and shut the college down, and I said, hey, I have nothing against you, we just pushed our way through. I'm paying for this, I'm gonna go through. So there is not everybody was involved to that degree.
Yes.
I would go to protest, but mostly as a social thing.
But he's right, and that's what a lot of it was social.
Sure.
Not all those people in those pictures gave a damn about that. It was a happening, and that's what the 60s was. It was a social revolution.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say my students are the same. Yeah. I mean, not all those people wearing pink hats right down in Washington 2 years ago were there for the march. They were there because it was a really good time.
I grew up in a family with 3 older brothers that served. When I got drafted, I went.
Sure.
We weren't the kind of family that, I don't know what I'm trying, my point is my grandfather and my father, they fought in World War II, they fought in Korea, and then when Vietnam came and they drafted, we went.
Of course, right. I mean, the number of people who evade the draft is quite small compared to the number who serve.
There's another point, one of the slides you showed was 570,000
Yeah.
draft dodgers were pardoned. You guys,
200,000.
drop in the bucket.
Tiny, right, far more people serve than evade.
Drop in the bucket if you take a nation. Drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
Yeah, another person over there.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Thank you point to that. My dad was a World War II Navy veteran. My 2 older brothers, one went Navy, enlisted in the Army in 66, 67. By the time I came along, I got drafted from high school in 68, not knowing what I was going to do, go to college or what. My dad was like against Vietnam. We felt that sending 3 boys to Vietnam, one of us wouldn't come back, and I was the one with a black mark over me. He just was convinced, and that's what turned him against the war. As a
Yeah.
Navy veteran, which was
I mean, I think that your point is, again, like the Vietnam experience was incredibly personal, right, to most people. And I'm not sure, to your point, that that's true of the wars today, right? Yeah, I was like you had a chance to say anything, yes.
You know, from 70 to 72, I worked at the Veterans Hospital as a social worker.
My aunt was a VA nurse.
Right, and I was on a VA stipend, so the Veterans Administration was paying for me to work with a lot of the Vietnam vets who were coming back. I was the same age
Yeah.
as most of them at that point. And I saw all kinds of damage done. People my age on drugs, people who lost limbs, people who lost all their limbs. I would work with those people during the week, and I would demonstrate on weekends. And I used to say that we should take all of the guys that are in the rehab center and put them at the head of a parade, and we would end the war a lot sooner.
Yeah.
So you could be both.
Yeah, I think that's
Support the
absolutely true.
troops, But also be,
To want to stop this war, right? Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think you're right. So somebody, yes, sir, you haven't said anything.
I have a lot of friends that went, and most of them said that they felt that the Johnson family was getting rich on the Vietnam War. That Lady Bird Johnson somehow owned railroads in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear that?
I've heard those rumors. Historians haven't been able to demonstrate that the Johnsons had a financial stake in the war. Certainly other people did, but I'm not sure the Johnsons did. Yeah. Oh, sir.
One thing that people who study wars fail to mention or do not want to look at, a lot of these demonstrators, especially the college-age kids, basically just plain cowards. They were afraid to go. They saw people were dying, people were getting hurt, and they just didn't want to do that. Nobody was.
I mean, I think you're right that some of them are certainly concerned about their personal safety, right? They didn't want to put their lives at risk. But I think a lot of them had a real moral objection to the war.
But we also have a moral responsibility to our government.
Two more questions? Who hasn't? Yeah. Oh, one of our students. Yes.
Hi, one of my main questions is, you were talking about how you had the feminists together and the
Yes.
black activists and everything, right? I see a lot of stuff have a lot of these people
Good.
kind of butting heads more so
Yeah.
than working together. Like even inside the LGBT movement,
Yes.
you have people like arguing each other about who belongs in the LGBT movement and who doesn't. It's like, how do you get all these people to get along and like just work together towards a common cause?
That's a great question. So what we've heard here is that today we see in social movements groups trying to work together, but they butt heads, right? They disagree about who should have a voice and what tactics they should use. To be fair, that was happening during the anti-war movement too. Just to give you a famous example of the big March on Washington in 1969, a group of the counterculture hippies wanted to have a mass chant where they all chanted Om, Om, and tried to levitate the Pentagon into the Potomac, right? No. And people from the Black Panthers thought that was crazy, right? And they said, you know, we're not going to go down to the Pentagon and protest and do this, and then we're going to be the ones that get arrested, right? Not these white kids from Columbia and Michigan. And so I think there was a lot of tension in some ways in these movements, particularly the biggest moments of activism, but that they found ways to work together, right, by sharing leadership responsibilities. And so when the Panthers made this critique in '69, this is the April movement, in the October '69 protest, they don't try any of that stuff, right? It is a pure political organizing moment. And so I think it's about making sure that all those voices were heard in the room and negotiated the understanding about who was comfortable with which kinds of activism. It's a great question. Yes, last question.
I guess I'd just like to say that my beautiful father was drafted into World War II in the very early 40s, and his unit liberated Dachau concentration camp. And the one and only time in my life that he discussed that event made me learn that just because you carry a gun does not make you brave. I say that in honor of my father who died in 2011, who was a wildly patriotic man, but just because you go to war and carry a gun does not make you a man.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.